Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We have Ahmed Shaikh with us today. He caught my eye recently with a number of articles that he wrote about Zakat organization, charitable organizations in the US, specifically that are doing work abroad, as well as LaunchGood, which is an organization that I've actually used before. So I was very interested in what he had to say. For those who are unfamiliar, Ahmed Shaikh is a board-certified specialist in estate planning and a former chair of the Orange County Bar Association section on trusts and estates. He has served hundreds of estate planning, asset protection, and charitable planning clients since 2006. He has a BA from San Diego State University and a JD from Mauer Law School, Indiana University, Bloomington. The reason I have him, as I mentioned, is because of the articles that he recently wrote, including International Zakat Organizations Overhead Ranked from Bloated to Lean, how LaunchGood keeps up to half of your charity for itself without telling you. Islamic Relief USA's new Zakat policy is built for administrative bloat. And Penny Appeal USA needs to get its story straight on Zakat overhead. So it makes a lot of sense to have Ahmed on to let us know about the content of his writings, what he found, anything that we should be aware of. And I should mention here that just because I do have Ahmed on the podcast doesn't mean I endorse any of his views. His views are his own. Nor am I saying that what he reports is accurate. This is something that you should look into and check out for yourself. And without further ado, Ahmed, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Before we go any deeper into your writings, if you could tell us, because I gave the bio, but if you could say in your own words a bit about yourself and why it is that this is something that's really near and dear to you. Why did you endeavor to actually look into these organizations and write about them?
So I started writing about Muslim nonprofits about 2015 or so. I've been doing a lot of estate planning. I've been doing a lot of charitable planning as well. So I do things like, various sorts of charitable trusts for clients, people who want to do charitable tax planning. So I do advise. I've had this practice of advising clients with respect to charitable giving for some time as part of my estate planning practice. I was on the executive council of the Islamic Society of North America some years ago as well, where I started to engage with the issue of Zakat. Around that time, or a little bit before that, before I did estate planning, I was a civil rights attorney as well. And so I have an inkling for things that kind of go on with police and with law enforcement within the Muslim community. And there was this program called Countering Violent Extremism that was coming up within the Muslim community here in the Los Angeles area. And I started writing about it. There were some Muslim organizations that were looking to get money from governments to be involved in the national security state. And, it just occurred to me that, nonprofits, they seem to really like money. And the ethics around some of these organizations might be a little bit questionable. There wasn't really anybody who was writing about these types of organizations at the time or exploring like what is going on here. What are Muslim community members being told? What's being represented to them? There's no government here no Muslim government here. We actually, in other countries around the world where there's a Muslim majority, inheritance is dealt with through the laws. Zakah is collected by the government, and there isn't anything like that. We all have these private institutions that deal with zakah, and I noticed that these organizations were collecting money, and they didn't really have any. They were using money in zakah for very strange purposes. They were interpreting zakah in a way that didn't seem right to me. Zakah is meant to go from the rich to the poor, but several organizations seem to treat it like taking money from the rich and giving it to the rich. It's would have big galas, invite comedians, invite singers, have programs like this and say, oh, this is zakat eligible because of thus and so. And you're not necessarily benefiting anybody except your own economic class. Large masajid, I mean, in areas with multi-million-dollar homes, are building masajid, are building, they're doing, their phase 3 expansions or whatever using zakat funds. And that seems fundamentally inequitable.
I'd like to address the ranking that you have for international zakat organizations.
Okay.
And you rank them based on how much of the dollar that is donated to them goes to what you call overhead. Is that correct?
So, not exactly. So, I looked at what I considered based on the 990 information, which is the tax form, of course, that nonprofits fill out in the United States, how much they report as being head for overhead or money that really stays in the United States. And in some cases, like Islamic Relief, for example, they provide some grants, particularly as well. So I excluded those, as well as grants that they give overseas. And there's just one in particular, which is Islamic Relief Worldwide in their case. But in the case of other nonprofits, they might have an organization overseas that they grant to. So in the 990, it just tells you like what are they granting overseas. If it is an organization that's job is primarily or exclusively to just raise money in the United States and send it overseas for programs and services overseas, you're basically treating the United States as just an ATM. Just you're taking money from the United States, from donors here, and you're giving it for services or programs overseas. And so it's relatively easy to figure out that, okay, overhead here is primarily just in the service or exclusively in the service of raising money, of doing marketing, of paying your domestic salaries or that sort of thing. What happens is that there is a distinction made in the 990 and in nonprofit accounting in general about programmatic expenses versus administrative or marketing, that type of thing. Not necessarily marketing, but administrative. All kinds of expenses can be divided up into programmatic, including things that maybe really shouldn't be programmatic, at least in the eye of what I think a donor should look at. So, for example, if you're doing a fundraising dinner, is not a program that you're actually donating for. You are donating if you're giving to a nonprofit that is there for the purpose of giving money to poor people, then you as a donor are probably thinking, I'm giving this money for the poor. You're not thinking I'm giving it to Google or to Facebook for advertising. You're not thinking I'm giving it to, for a videographer or, the stand-up comedian or whatever other expenses it is that a nonprofit might have in service of raising money, doing training for their employees, sending them off to junkets or going to a Muslim doctors convention or whatever the case may be. These are all, of course, very expensive activities, and potentially they can be cataloged by nonprofits in various ways, and in some ways might be misleading to donors.
So typically these sort of programmatic expenses, they're not reported as overhead, but you included them in your definition of overhead. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think that's correct. That's what I endeavored to do. 990s, there isn't a lot of uniformity necessarily in how 990s get reported, and there could be some ways that, and I mentioned this when I write about it. It's not going to be a perfect apple to apple comparison between one nonprofit and another. I don't necessarily rank them in terms of well, this is a great nonprofit or this is a bad nonprofit just based on that criteria alone. And what I understand, or at least what I'm being told by people who've been in the sector or people from these individual organizations who sometimes reach out to me as well, is that the operations that happen overseas could sometimes be just as or more wasteful, and they are definitely much more of a black box than the expenses that occur in the United States. So once it actually leaves the United States, in the case of many of these nonprofits, we don't actually know what happens to it. We don't know what happens to the funds. There isn't a lot of accounting for what occurs in any great detail at all. And a lot of the times you're just supposed to trust what's happening. I remember talking to one employee of one of these larger nonprofits in the Muslim community in the US, this person had some unrelated concerns about what was happening at that particular nonprofit that this person wanted to bring up to me, but happened to mention something about a donor or a conversation with a donor who had paid for a well, like a water well, and wanted their family's name on the water well, and had a friend who did something similar. And one of the things he noticed was the photograph that they showed looked virtually the same as a water well that his friend had. And he said, like, you guys just swapped the name, didn't you? Isn't that what happened? And, the person at the nonprofit said, no, brother, we wouldn't do something like that. Then sort of thought about it. And, looks like we kind of did that. They're doing a variety of different programs, or claiming to do a variety of different programs. Some of these I'm sure a lot of them are definitely happening, but we don't necessarily have a great read on what precisely is happening. And I was just very surprised to learn that. And so the overhead, even if the overhead is high in the United States, their operations overseas might be stellar. And maybe an operation that has very low overhead in the United States has operations overseas that are very poor, and really can't tell which is which,
But it's probably
just by
unlikely,
looking
right?
at those numbers.
I mean, it seems logical that if your operations are poor in the U.S., it's probably poor outside the U.S. But
Could be, but
but point
they're run
taken.
by different people. Yeah. This whole journey started around the time of because I was writing about nonprofits, and an employee from Islamic Relief actually reached out to me and said that he felt really bad because he thought he was misleading donors, because he was informed by his higher ups that when people ask about the administration, this is how you answer it. And he went to a program where they were distributing funds to orphan families with the orphans, and he saw that the amount that was being distributed was far less than what he was actually collecting in the United States.
How much?
And
What was
well,
the
it
percentage?
was, yeah. So I think in the article that I wrote last year, it was a $65 donation. About $30 went to the family, something along those lines. I don't have the
So
numbers
less
in
than
front of me.
half.
Yeah, yeah. And he walked through why something like that would happen, because there's a huge amount of overhead here in the United States. Then there's overhead that happens in the UK, because the money gets shipped over to the UK. They take a cut, then it goes over to the country where the programs are going on, and then there's another cut. And the donor thinks, yeah, there's going to be a cut. You can understand that there's administrative fees, and they're telling you what it is, but the donor probably wouldn't agree to that steep of a cut, or at least doesn't really have the opportunity to, because you're normally going to assume that what this person is telling you about the administrative costs is true. And they don't necessarily understand that what is and isn't an administrative cost is really just a accounting game that's being played. That's not the practical example. That's not practically what's happening with a nonprofit. And it's important for Muslims to know what's happening to their money. And my thought process when I endeavored to write about this, about nonprofits, especially in the newsletter, because I used to write over at Muslim Matters a lot, is that we're not going to pray on a soiled carpet, right? I mean, if we're going to pray, we're going to do our worship, we're going to do it with some ihsan, right? And we're doing this thing, this zakah, and we seem to be doing it very carelessly. In zakah in particular, but also any other charitable giving that we do, we want to make sure that it's as effective as possible. The other aspect of it is, well, part of this waste is, this is a transfer of wealth. Zakat is a transfer of wealth, right? And how much of it is really to the poor, and how much is it just to other affluent people that are benefiting from zakat throughout this entire chain? And so a lot of it is, how much of it is real charitable work and how much it is just kind of rent seeking that's taking place throughout this entire process. A lot of the zakah internationally is not hand-to-hand distribution of zakah. So the orphan program is a relatively rare example of Islamic relief in particular doing some sort of hand-to-hand zakah. And then there's these cuts taking place, and you can see a stark example of what's going on. Much of the time, it's like you're getting a box of food, or there's a training program, or they're building some sort of an installation like a well or something, right? Maybe there's a masjid, maybe there's something else that's being built or claimed to be built or something. I mean, I don't want to pick on Islamic Relief in particular, because I don't want to, I don't want to cast aspersions about the work that they're doing. They might be doing just wonderful work overseas. I don't know. I do know that, throughout the sector, there are some problems with accountability on this stuff. One person that I talked to just a few days ago who was affiliated with one of these charities was telling me that, things are, there are some serious problems with accountability, with corruption, nepotism, things like that when it comes to the delivery of aid overseas.
I wanted to clarify the claim that was being made, which is that not only is the true overhead number being communicated clearly, but that overhead number is bloated by things that are not necessary for the charity process. Basically, there are things that are, or are you just saying maybe these things exist, maybe they don't, but we just don't have any vision and clarity into, or transparency into, how these organizations operate?
So part of my thinking with respect to this particular process with zakah is that we've moved away from hand-to-hand distribution of zakah, and we're moving, and there's this thing called zakah for development, right? There's Z for D. That, the notion that, and there are these scholars who provided these fatwas, and going back several years ago, particularly in the Middle East, where they, because zakah is collected by governments, and they figure, well, we can use these for general purpose, for general welfare, right? So we can use it for construction projects, or we can use it for, we can use it for various sorts of generalized development, which is and should be a controversial use of zakat. So even humanitarian organizations will figure, we're not really going to give it directly to the poor. We think that it's better placed in our hands, and we're going to spend it for a variety of purposes. And they're good purposes, right? I mean, who doesn't like things like, job training, or, feeding people, or what have you? But then you're making a choice. Instead of giving a person money, giving a poor person money and saying, go ahead, you take the money and you decide what to do. If you want to start a business, or if you want to, you want to get books for your kids, whatever the case may be, this is your money and it's yours. Go take it, right? Because that's your right. So you're a zakah beneficiary. So that's hand-to-hand zakah. And yeah, I think what you were getting at with your question is, that whole process of making value judgments about what to do with the money could be problematic.
Sure.
And wasteful.
Sure. No, I can see that. I
Mhm.
suppose this may be, however, a sort of a separate topic from the one that I do want to zero in on,
Yeah,
which is the, what is actually, so the topic of, what's the best way to spend a zakat dollar to stretch it as far as possible in order to like get the most benefit to the most number of people is perhaps, I think it's a legitimate discussion to have.
it is.
On
It
the
is.
other
Yeah.
hand, something that's perhaps more black and white, I think, is, okay, our overhead is 5%, but in reality, when you look at the percentage of money that is leaving the donor's hand and actually being spent on something charitable, that
Yeah.
percentage is way less than what the donor suspects. I think that's much more black and white. And
It
to
is.
sort
It
of
is. Yeah.
actually put some color onto this, let's look at your list. You have 12 organizations in your article.
Okay.
And let's very briefly just go by them, because I know that the listeners are probably chomping at the bit to just hear what these organizations are. So let's start with Islamic Relief USA. You say that they're, based on your calculations, the overhead, which includes the programmatic expenses that you touched upon earlier, the overhead turns out to be closer to 40%, basically
That's right.
38.2% is what you have. That's basically the percentage of every dollar that the US donor is giving that actually doesn't go to charity. And then with Islamic Relief USA in particular, there's aside from the 40%, there's other sort of toll takers along the way before the dollar actually reaches the intended destination, correct?
Yeah. So, for example, Islamic Relief spends millions of dollars on Google advertising, right? They spend a lot of money on things like conferences, fundraising dinners, things like that. And part of that can be attributed to programmatic in the way Islamic Relief looks at it. Part of it could be looked at administrative. And they do this for salaries as well, right? So millions of dollars in salaries in the United States can be programmatic, but Islamic Relief's principal job is just to send money to the UK, right? I mean, they're basically they're an auxiliary to Islamic Relief worldwide, and their job is really just to raise money here. So it's relatively easy to look at an organization like that. Now they do give some grants, it's really minor as to what they give in terms of grants in the United States, and a lot of what they do is public relations and often just in service of raising more money. So there are a lot of things that they might count as programmatic, but really if you are an Islamic Relief donor, my assumption of the typical Islamic Relief donor, I have many that are clients. I'm putting Islamic Relief in somebody's will like right now. I mean, I've got like one going on right now where I'm going to be doing that for somebody. So, I know Islamic Relief donors very well, and I know that their interest is giving money to poor people overseas. That's what they want to do. They want to be able to benefit the work that Islamic Relief says they are doing. And so it is important for donors to at least be educated about it. Now I understand that once they know what's going on, they might be like, that's fair, that's okay, right? I mean, sure, I think they should advertise, or I think they should pay people well. They should have lots of people getting paid in six figures. I'm totally cool with that. If that's what's happening, then that's fine. I would still suggest, especially like with respect to Zakat, which is, I think, special, right? Zakat there are these rules on Zakat, right? I mean, and obviously there are going to be different people that are going to express their rules differently, but Zakat is not meant to benefit nonprofit organizations. They're a conduit. It's not for them, and it's not for their employees. It's a means to an end.
Yeah, and maybe there's an argument to be made here. Okay, well, we're spending 40% on, things that are not necessarily, transferring money, but that 40% that we spend is generating, this much more in sort of charitable contributions. And so when you do the math, actually, over time, it makes sense in terms of actually increasing the amount of charity that's being collected. But to your point, I think that what's needed is clarity.
I mean, look,
So this is
it's
how we
really,
spend our
yeah.
dollar. This is our thinking behind it. Are you okay with it? If you are, then we're the organization for you. If you're not, then we're not.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that yes, part of it has to do with just a proper disclosure to donors, that donors need to know that nonprofits are not playing games with administrative programmatic type stuff, right? That donors know that if I give X amount of money to this nonprofit, then it's going to benefit the poor and the needy, right? By, X minus whatever the administrative cost is that you're telling me, right? That's what I would like to know as a donor. And so one of the main things is just be straight with me about what's happening. The other aspect of it is, yeah, maybe it's fine for an organization to spend, quite a bit of money on their growth. I don't think that it's appropriate for Zakat to be used that way, but it might be okay for other funds to be used that way. And if that's the case, then you're looking at efficiency, right? I think if you look at charitable organizations in some ways, like you might look at an organization as an investor, you probably don't have a problem with the CEO and executives getting paid well. But if their pay is just out of whack with the performance of the organization, then you might have some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think towards that point, the incentive systems that basically govern the organization are, I think, just as important to clarify as the where the funds go, because
Right.
what you incentivize eventually happens. So, what are the incentives of like the CEO of this organization? What are the incentives of, upper management? Are they rewarded based on the charitable results that they end up with, or how are they rewarded exactly? That will, I think, be really instructive for donors to understand, what exactly is going to happen with their dollar after they donate it. All right. So I mentioned number 12 was Islamic Relief USA. Number 11 is basically very close. So you had 38.2 for Islamic Relief USA, 38.1 for Zakat Foundation,
Yeah. Yeah.
37.8 for Penny Appeal USA, 34.5 for Mercy Without Limits. Number 8, 28.6 for Developments in Literacy. Number 7, 25.16 for UNHCR. Now, this is not a Muslim-run organization, but it often appeals to Muslims.
Yes.
Number 6, 24% goes to Helping Hand for Relief and Development. Number 5, 18% for Mercy USA. Number 4, 17.67% for Muslim Aid. Number 3, 12.5% for Life for Relief and Development. Number 2, 11.9% for Indian Muslim Relief and Charities. And number 1, with only 8.48% overhead, is for Baitul Mal. Do you want to say anything about Baitul Mal?
Baitul Mal, I think that it is important to maybe look at them a little bit further as to what they're going to be doing in the next few years. They had a massive infusion of donations in 1 year. So they just had a very successful year. Normally what happens with any organization is that you set a budget for your spending for that year. If a few people give you like millions and millions of dollars, maybe for the next year you might up your budget, or you might do more things with that money, or you might start to become a lot more efficient with how you use it. And they had a year-over-year growth that was just stunning. So I don't know if that's an anomaly, or if that's real as to what they're going to be doing going forward in terms of their efficiency. One thing I should talk about as well is that these organizations, for the most part, don't really have written zakat policies. They don't necessarily consult with scholars with respect to how the zakat is going to be used. A lot of them just sort of do things seemingly based on mood. And so I think that zakat as an act of worship is, I think, taken insufficiently seriously by nonprofits, even if they are relatively efficient with how they use their funds. So I think that going forward, all of these organizations, whether they're, you consider them domestically efficient or wasteful, can really do a better job in explaining what they're doing, how they use the funds, and how good they are as custodians of really our worship, right?
Have you
They
looked
don't
at
necessarily.
non-Muslim organizations and how they do it, and have you compared the two?
So you pointed to one organization called UNHCR. That's the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and they have a zakat fund. And I said some things about them that made it sound like I'm very skeptical of them. And I am, in a way, skeptical. I'm going to be writing another article about them, I hope. It should come out in this month. And they are the best international zakat organization, as best as I can tell. And the reason for that is that if you donate $1,000 to the zakat fund at UNHCR, you're getting $1,000 to a person who is eligible for zakat, not in services, but in literal actual cash. And so you have an international, and there's no cuts at all taken UNHCR is governed by an international convention. They do get a lot of money from governments. So it's an intergovernmental organization, and they have an infrastructure, and there's a lot of refugees. About 60% of the world's refugees are Muslims. When they're refugees, they register with UNHCR. So they have this built-in infrastructure. They don't have they have iris scan everybody just to make sure that the funds aren't, the funds aren't being wasted, or there isn't any duplicative stuff happening. They've actually sent people out to verify. There have been Muslim organizations, or one Muslim organization that's gone out to verify their activities in 3 different countries. They've had some suggestions on how the organization might improve, but the hand-to-hand aspect of zakah for refugees, I mean, UNHCR does things that Muslim organizations really can't do and are not positioned to do, right? They don't have a UN treaty backing them. Having said that, UNHCR is a secular organization, and there are real concerns. I think one of the major concerns when I was talking to a couple of shiuch about this is the idea of sovereignty. Sovereignty for the Muslim community is kind of a big deal. As one person explained it to me, maybe the Walt Disney Company would do a better job than the Saudis in running Hajj. But that doesn't mean that we want them to do that, right? We probably want a Muslim organization, as imperfect as they might be, or a Muslim government, to do something like that. And so this is our worship, and we are handing over our worship to a non-Muslim organization. Now, because they're not proper administrators of zakah, they can't take any cut. So when you give a donation to UNHCR, all of the money goes to an interest-free bank account in Geneva, and all of it then gets distributed to refugees in cash.
And there was no organizations that you found that were Islamic, that were run by Muslims, that did anything close to just hand-to-hand charity or zakat?
Well, there are domestically. So my local masjid does that, right? My local masjid will, the Islamic Center of Irvine, they have a zakat program where they will literally take your money without taking any cuts or anything, as the masjid has its separate overhead, and there are volunteers within the community who will find people and give them the money, and you're trusting them to, of course, do that. And there are masjid-based programs in other places that will do that. There's another organization called Uplift here that in Southern California. They have other programs and services or what have you, but they definitely will do some hand-to-hand distribution or something like that.
A Muslim organization?
It's a Muslim organization. So they will do that, but they'll do it domestically. They don't do it internationally. Remember, internationally, it's really, hard to do.
I don't trust the United Nations in any way. So
right.
I don't want to give them any money. I'm looking for other options. Yeah.
I actually understand that completely. I would be looking for other options as well. I think UNHCR is relatively well positioned to do that because they're the ones that have contact with the refugees. But yeah, internationally, if you give, there's a bunch of compliance, and it's true that there has to be overhead. I mean, you need lawyers, you need there's this department of, there's a treasury department, there's a whole bunch of regulation.
That goes back to the fact that
international stuff is no joke anyway, right?
Even if the Zakat organization claims that they have zero overhead is just too good to be true, right? Because if they claim that they have zero overhead, then someone else is sponsoring their work. I mean, they're getting their overhead from somewhere else. I mean, so maybe if, let's say the organization has sadaqah and zakat, and they say, oh, well, zakat is just 1-to-1 in terms of charity to distribution. That just means that the people who are paying sadaqah are paying for the overhead of zakat. So 0% overhead for zakat, I feel is not really feasible. It's not practical.
So for the Muslim organizations, we're not actually seeing the numbers. So anybody who actually says that, and I know Islamic Relief has mentioned this, or their representatives talk about this to anybody who would listen, that that the whole thing about 100% distribution policy, that's all fake. Nobody does that. There's they'll be at least we're saying that we have overhead. Now, they may be fudging on what the overhead numbers are by a lot, but they're at least not saying that it's 0%. I think that if you're taking from sadaqah, I'd like to actually see that. I mean, especially something like Zakat Foundation, right? Zakat Foundation, it's in the name. I mean, how much, I mean, is it really that huge of a percentage of non-Zakat funds that are going to a place called Zakat Foundation? I don't know, but it would actually be nice to see what's happening there. I think that there are some places where nonprofits in the United States can look to funding sources for Zakat that, that might be pretty reasonable, right? Like, for example, corporate matching programs. You give Zakat and you just, you have like you work for a large company that has a corporate matching program. Maybe you don't mind that it's not Zakat, it's going to the to overhead. Maybe there's also like a tipping type of a thing, and this is what UNHCR does. They say 6.5%. So if you give Zakat, you wanna contribute towards some of the overhead. You don't have to, but if you want to, then you can pay 6.5%. Then they have their sadaqah, and they say that they're going to take a cut of 6.5%, and the rest will be in cash distribution to a refugee, which is pretty. I mean, which is pretty efficient. With UNHCR, non-Muslim organization, they get governmental support. They have like a large budget. They can probably swing it. Another
You lost me.
organization.
You lost me at governmental support.
Yeah, I know.
It's
It's governmental support, and there's going to be we have
yeah,
there's going to be some questions about that.
yeah.
I think that the organization that audited them, the Muslim organization that audited them, they went into three of the several countries that they operate in, and one of the concerns that they had was that, hey, one of the main reasons we're doing this is we want to make sure that Muslim refugees know that Muslims didn't abandon them. But you're not actually even telling these people that the money that you're giving is zakat, and it
It's
came from
from
other
Muslims.
Muslims. The other one was Indian Muslim Relief and Charities, IMRC, that was on the list. They have overhead. They get about $1 million a year at this point, is my understanding, from their endowment. So they've collected in a pretty substantial endowment. They have a cemetery, they have like a commercial office building, they have a bunch of other investments that they have as an organization. And 100%, depending on how things go with them, from year to year, but their goal is that 100% of their US overhead is covered by the endowment. And they actually do that, right? I mean, they don't have a lot of employees. It's a pretty small operation. And so they could tell you conceivably that, 100% of your zakah goes to, their programs in India.
Moving on to the next big topic that I want to talk about. LaunchGood
Uh-huh.
is one that many American Muslims are familiar with. They have basically crowdfunding of different charitable causes,
Sure.
and they advertise that they don't have any platform fees, right? They
That's right.
actually have a tipping system, but there's also another big source of revenue. I don't know what the split is basically between their marketing and their tipping. I don't know, but you wanted to cast some light on, how they make a lot of their revenue. So
Sure.
if you could expand on that, please.
I mean, I pointed out in my article a PDF that is for marketing to nonprofit organizations, both in the United States and overseas. LaunchGood is a pretty global organization at this point, but they're based in the United States. They do market heavily to American Muslims as well, and they will try to they say that they have this algorithm that gets ROI for an organization of somewhere between 4 and 2x from whatever it is that they spend. And so that's kind of what they've been doing.
So
They charge very high fees. Yeah.
just to clarify that, they're saying that if you, let's say you have a campaign that you want to promote,
Yeah.
you can go to LaunchGood, post your campaign, and if you paid LaunchGood, let's say $5,000 to promote your campaign on
Yeah.
their platform, so to give it sort of a more prominent location, to
Sure.
mention it more often, to include it in newsletters or whatever mechanisms they have.
Yeah.
If you give them 5,000, they'll return basically 10, 15,000 in terms of like the amount of charity that they gather for your campaign. Is that accurate?
Something like that, yeah. And so at the very least, they will give you a 1-for-1. So they offer a guarantee So the money that you put in with them is almost an escrow. And if you get your, and I'd have to actually look at their advertising, their marketing program. The numbers are quite large. They generally don't like. They prefer not to deal with the 5,000s. I mean, it's going to be, they have some very high fees, but the idea is that they're going to have this algorithm, and the algorithm is going to try to push. It's going to try to make the revenue at the very least, at least 1 to 1. So if you put in 20,000, you should get 20,000 back. That's their guarantee, which means that of course you just broke even, but ideally you'll get double or triple that, maybe more. So it is something, but you're not going to get like 10x or anything like that, right? Because then they'll push it to other charities as far as just the visibility goes. So yeah, what they are doing essentially looks a lot like a commission, just in terms of how it is that they're approaching it and how, frankly, organizations are looking at it. They're not actually telling donors that, except in email. I think they tell you that the emails are sponsored, but on the website they don't actually tell you this stuff as to how these charities are being preferred. And the platform has almost 8,000. I mean, last time I checked, they have almost 8,000 campaigns going on at any given time. And so what exactly comes up as the campaign that people are going to be looking at various stages? Because if you go to LaunchGood, maybe you're in a generous mood or what have you, you're just donated someplace. It's like if you go on your shopping cart or what have you on Amazon, they might suggest a bunch of other things. They're going to suggest other charities to you at that particular stage, or at various stages. They obviously know what they have, pretty good analytics, and they're going to try to get Muslims to donate to the places that pay them. It's a process of getting to know more about the audience and essentially manipulating them into giving to particular organizations that have what looks like a pretty unethical practice of not telling them that this is basically a commercial fundraising operation.
I see. So is there anything inherently wrong that you see in their offer of, okay, let's guarantee your basically marketing spend, and we're going to make sure that you get at least what you spent in marketing back in terms of charity? Is there
Yeah.
anything inherently wrong in that you see, or is it the fact that they don't really disclose it? That
So
we're putting
yeah.
these organizations in front of you, and there's no like ad like there is in like Google. There's no indication that LaunchGood is pushing this onto your screen. Is that your beef with LaunchGood, or is it just the entire structure of their revenue system?
So I probably wouldn't have very much to complain about with them if they were transparent with what they are doing, if they were registered with the state attorney generals in the states that they operate, and if they follow the Federal Trade Commission Act rules with respect to disclosing this stuff. They haven't been, last I checked, they haven't been doing that. And so yeah, I mean, I think that if Muslims look at these websites, and because a lot of these organizations are relatively low quality, a lot of them are just, they seem, the one example that they actually provide, I think, Bond Shams, which was this water, they claim to deliver fresh water to 1 million people, but I think they only spent like $400 the year before. And how were they able to do that? I don't know. And they were able to raise an enormous amount of money on the platform
Does
through
LaunchGood do
advertising.
any vetting of these campaigns before it?
So as far as I understand, they do some vetting. I think primarily they do vetting of the campaign itself to make sure that it's going to be an effective on their platform, right? So the idea is that you want to be able to generate revenue. So they want to be able to maximize how much revenue the campaign is going to get. And so a lot of it has to do with like the copywriting, the stock photography, or the photography that they use, things like that.
So
Not necessarily.
vetting with regards to the capacity of the organization to deliver on the promises that they're making?
Oh no, they are not doing that. Their terms of service specifically state that, yeah, it's basically buyer beware. I mean, you're not, yeah, that's on the donor. Yeah. As far as the organization itself, are they good? Are they bad? Are they totally corrupt? Or are they basically just scammers? I mean, all of the there's a lot of there's a lot of that type of thing going on. I wrote about LaunchGood last year as well, and I pointed to some specific campaigns that were incredibly shady and weird. And those types of things come up on the LaunchGood platform pretty frequently. They don't vet this stuff for the most part for those types of things. They do vet it from I think a business perspective. From LaunchGood as a business, they probably do a decent job. At least with respect to the campaigns that are paying them, because they're now invested in the success, the financial success of the campaign. They're not necessarily invested in the charitable mission of the organization, or whether it has a legitimate charitable function or not. They don't appear to care about that.
So would you say on aggregate that their net impact is a positive one or negative?
So I think that a place that LaunchGood might be very effective for people, for some individuals. So say, for example, there's a family, like an individual family that's in need. Maybe they had like a breadwinner that passed away suddenly, or somebody is sick and needs, medical care or something like that. Those types of crowdfunding opportunities, where, people especially go through their social circle and, then share it online with the, on Instagram or whatever, that, okay, well, here's a family that's in need and help them out. That's not charitable, at least in the, the federal tax sense. It might be charitable in the Islamic sense, right? But, normally you can't have charity under US law. It can't really inure to the benefit of a particular person or a family or something like that. They're probably not looking at, a tax benefit when you're donating for something like that anyway. And yeah, crowdfunding I think it could be good in those situations. But say, for example, you want to do donate to something like Islamic Relief, right? And if they want to advertise there, what have you, they advertise on Google, they advertise on Facebook. Why not advertise, why not advertise on LaunchGood? The advantage of LaunchGood is if you advertise on Facebook or Google, you have to disclose that you're being advertised to. And a lot of donors, at least, as far as some donors' psychology might be like, why am I paying for an ad? I mean, I don't want to pay for an ad, and so they might look for another way of doing it, right? I mean, might be skeptical that, why am I being advertised to for Zakat? Some people won't care, some people will. And it's definitely going to affect people's behavior to know whether or not they are being advertised to. If you look at something like LaunchGood, you see that, well, everything is an advertisement that you're looking at, right? I mean, that's going to look, just from like a user experience type of thing, it probably will look ugly. And so LaunchGood will probably need to work that out as far as these types of organizations that want to advertise. But as far as the good thing, I mean, I think crowdfunding in general, not necessarily just LaunchGood, has been beneficial to a number of people, a number of families. But for charities, I mean, it's just another way of them, potentially reaching out to people, or of advertising. I don't think it's anything special. If you wanted to donate to a charity, you can always just go to their website or respond to their email or something like that, or go to their actual event. If there's a representative coming to your masjid, you can just drop money in the box or whatever. So, there's a lot of other ways to give to charity that might be more efficient than going through a provider that is being paid essentially a commission.
Right. I mean, I do think that there is value in sort of putting everything in the same place, like LaunchGood does. I mean, as I mentioned, I've donated through LaunchGood before, and
Sure.
let's say I want to, sponsor an orphan or something like that. You can basically see the opportunities that are available to sponsor an orphan. Maybe you can't, sponsor the entire amount. You can sponsor part of it. There's certainly some benefit there. Wouldn't you agree?
So I think that if they were disclosing what's happening, right, in terms of
Right.
the financial structure of it, this would be in person as well. Like, if you went to a fundraising dinner, right, for an orphan program, and there was a motivational speaker that was telling you to donate, and they disclosed to you in advance of your donation that the guy who's speaking to you and fundraising is going to take a 30% cut of all of your donations, right?
Well, that's going to
Would
be
that
really awkward for the speaker, isn't it?
right. I mean, but how would that influence your donation, or how would that make your evening go, right? Now, if something similar were happening with a website, we don't necessarily think of it in the same terms, even though economically it's pretty much the same thing, except on a much bigger scale. So, I would have you sort of think about it in those terms. And you're not actually seeing that on the website because they're not showing it to you in those terms, right? The disclosure isn't happening. So this is why attorneys general in the United States regulate charity solicitors. That's why this stuff is supposed to be disclosed, because they can pull on your heartstrings and talk about charity and how wonderful the work is that they're doing, and they can talk about orphans, and oh my gosh, who doesn't want to support orphans? I mean, what kind of monster doesn't want to support orphans? But what exactly is happening here behind the scenes, and how are people really benefiting, especially from manipulating people religiously about and during the month of Ramadan? What's going on here? And yeah, it is important to disclose things. And if there is a benefit to it, and you say, yeah, it's all in one place, but hey, we have this sort of commission structure that's going on. You might be like, well, that's cool and all that you guys are raising money for orphans, but maybe I'm going to look for a place that doesn't, where, instead of 25% or 30% going to these guys, more of it is actually going to the orphan. How about that? Right?
All right, so Ahmed, this has been thoroughly
Right.
depressing.
Right.
But at the same time, I think that it's important to, and like I said from the beginning, I don't make
Right.
any claims regarding the veracity of the comments that were made during this podcast. I do think that the exercise of critical interrogation of these organizations that, as you mentioned, pull on the heartstrings of Muslims. And sometimes, listen, pulling on the heartstrings is not a bad thing. If you're motivating someone to
Yeah.
do the right thing, pulling on heartstrings is not bad. But pulling on heartstrings in order to manipulate or to achieve an outcome that's not being disclosed is something that I think we all want to avoid. It seems like because I know that the idea or the thought in people's mind probably at this point in the podcast is, okay, what am I supposed to do right now? How am I supposed to give to charity? How am I supposed to give zakat? It turns out there are very few organizations that can be trusted, just based on this podcast. Now, obviously, there are some organizations out there that
There
can
are.
be trusted. The issue is finding them and being able to have the confidence in your finding. But what is the average Muslim supposed to do in terms of giving to sadaqah, giving to zakat? What would your approach be to that?
I think that having a good system of hand-to-hand zakah is essential communal infrastructure in every Muslim community. I think that it is important that we not be islands, that people who are, affluent, you know, make an effort. Like, there are people, I think it's vital that we make an effort as a community, even if we're not doing it individually, that there be people in our community. And if it's not, you look to your right and you look to your left and nobody else is doing it, then you should be the one doing it, where you go out and, you start a program where you just make sure that, anybody who wants to give zakat directly to poor people, there's a way to actually do that. I don't think it's terribly hard to do. And so, that's really important, especially for like a local community. Like, I'm blessed here, and we're blessed here in Southern California, where there are people who do that. And I'm reasonably confident that in a lot of local communities, that type of thing exists. I also think that, it is the work of these international humanitarian organizations. I mean, it's vital. I mean, there is an incredible amount of global inequity going on. And, it does make a lot of sense for people to donate globally as well. I think that, it is important to move the needle with respect to these organizations. I do think that just paying attention to these organizations and asking questions, looking at the numbers, demanding more numbers where those things don't exist, is going to help make these organizations better, right? And I'm not going to get it right a lot of the time, right? I might make mistakes as well in how it is that I might critique these organizations. And, That's entirely possible. But I think the process, and I think everybody, I mean, I don't know if that everybody necessarily has the time to do this or wants to do it. And, the people will have different types of expertise. But, I think as a community, among your friends, family members, there should always be people who have some level of expertise on charitable giving, on what the good charities are and why they're good, and is able to actually critique these organizations as well. Just because they do good work, and just because they're charitable organization doesn't mean that they should be given complete deference, or we should be silent if there's something that's going wrong, or that there's something that they can do better. I mean, like I was telling you before, I mean, we're not going to pray on a soiled carpet. And so, why would we give the garbage charities? We need to make sure that we vet these organizations, that they are good. And they're, like one of the things I did with the rankings as well is that these charities are very different from each other. I mean, these are, the issues with Islamic relief are not sector wide. There are going to be places that are much more careful, even if they can do better in certain areas. Like maybe they can have a written zakat policy, maybe they can have a transparency report or something like that. But some are much better stewards of donated money than others, and it is important to be able to understand that.
Absolutely.
I don't want to make it sound like, these are just basically all cynical people that are, corrupt or whatever, or they're just lying to donors or what have you. I think that there's I know about a lot of what's happening because a lot of the times people from these charities give me a call. They'll give me a call, or they'll message me about what's happening or what's troubling them or what have you. And so that's how I hear about some of this stuff in the first place. And of course, donors as well. And so there's a lot of great people in these organizations. There's a lot of opportunities for them to get better. I write from a perspective of donors. I want donors to be better at being donors, but as this process hopefully continues and more people start to pay attention, I think these organizations are going to get better as well, inshallah.
Absolutely.
Hopefully that's a lot more,
So,
that's a lot less depressing than we ended with before.
yeah, it's good that we end on that high note. What we want to do
Right.
is make sure that organizations know that there are people that are watching them, that
Yeah.
that there are people that are following their actions, and we'll hold them accountable. I think having that feeling amongst organizations is a good one. It makes their operations more efficient, makes everything more transparent, hopefully. So I think what you did was an important thing, and I hope more people do the same. But what we don't want, as mentioned, is more cynicism in the community. We have too much of that. We don't need any more of it. We don't want people to be depressed. We don't want people to be cynical. We don't want people to be, demotivated or take this as an opportunity to say, oh, well, I'm not going to give to sadaqah. I'm not going to give to zakat. No, just be intelligent about how you're doing it and do the due diligence about where you put your money and hold the organizations accountable. Ask the tough questions. If you do a little bit of digging, I think you'll get to a lot better results than not doing any.
Oh, we can't be cynical. That's the
Yeah,
deen. I mean, it's like, it's literally, it's our religion. It's a third pillar of Islam. We have to do it. Right. I mean, it's like, yeah, there really isn't any option. We have to do it. It's just that we have to do it in the best possible way.
absolutely.
We have to, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it with excellence. Otherwise, what are we doing here? Right. And
Speaking of
so we just,
excellence,
right.
speaking of excellence, you do have an Ihsan newsletter that people can subscribe to. It's a paid
Right. Right.
newsletter, as I
No, it's not
understand.
actually.
Oh,
It's
it's
not
not a
paid.
paid newsletter. Okay.
No, it's not paid. It's
My follow-up question was going to be where does the overhead,
sun.substack.com.
how much of the subscription is overhead, but it turns out it's free.
Yeah, it's just something I do. I don't, yeah,
Yeah,
that's not my day job. So, I enjoy writing, and hopefully it's beneficial. No, I don't charge. Yeah, there's no charge for the Substack right now.
right now,
Maybe,
exactly.
maybe someday, if I feel like doing it, I don't know, but
Why not? I mean,
not
I
right
feel
now.
like it's a service, it's a valuable service, so why not?
Yeah, some
If it
point
allows you to do
possible.
more of it, why not?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
really, really glad that you came on the podcast,
Well, thanks
Ahmed. I
for
hope,
inviting me.
yeah, my
I know we
pleasure.
haven't interacted previously, and I was just great. Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I was really happy when Fatma said he's going to be on the podcast. I was like, that's great. I really enjoyed his articles. So yeah,
Wonderful.
thank you for doing that. I'll leave your contact info in the description of this podcast, inshallah. And thank you all listeners for listening to us. Until next time, take care of yourself. Make sure to give sadaqah and zakat. Make sure to do that. Until next time, take care of yourself. Assalamu alaikum, and peace be upon you all.
Alaikum assalam.